Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Levi Bellfield case, beginning with the quiet, suburban streets of Walton-on-Thames in the early spring of 2002. Imagine the air as it feels in late March, a lingering chill that clings to the damp pavement, even as the sun begins its slow descent toward the horizon. The wind carries a faint scent of river water and cut grass, a reminder that the world is beginning to wake from its winter slumber. It is Thursday, the 21st of March, and the town is settling into that familiar, rhythmic hum of the late afternoon. You can hear the distant chime of bicycle bells and the muffled roar of commuter trains pulling into the station. In this peaceful corner of Surrey, the shadows are long and soft, stretching across manicured lawns and brick garden walls. It is a place where safety is assumed, where the sounds of the neighborhood are comforting and predictable. Close your eyes and feel the weight of the day beginning to lift, replaced by the cool, humid embrace of the evening air. The world is turning gray, but the streetlights have not yet flickered to life, leaving the town in a gentle, hazy twilight. At 3:07, 13-year-old Millie Dowler leaves Heathside School in Weybridge. She is wearing her school uniform, a dark blue blazer that feels slightly heavy on her shoulders, a gray skirt, and a crisp white shirt. Her rucksack, a soft beige color, is slung over her shoulder, filled with the mundane weight of textbooks and schoolwork. Feel the texture of that heavy blazer against your arms, the way the fabric moves as she walks toward the Weybridge railway station with her friend. The station platform is busy with students and commuters, a sea of navy blue and charcoal gray. There is a specific sound to a train station in the afternoon, the rhythmic announcements over the speaker, the hiss of hydraulic doors, and the metallic clatter of the tracks. They board the train for the short journey to Walton-on-Thames, just one stop away. The compartment is warm, smelling of old upholstery, and the faint metallic tang of the electric rails. As the train pulls away, the scenery outside the window blurs into a smudge of green and brown, the trees still mostly bare, their branches reaching like thin fingers toward the overcast sky. Upon arriving at the Walton-on-Thames station, the two girls decide to stop for a small treat. They step into the station cafe, a small, bright space filled with the comforting aroma of fried food and vinegar. They order a portion of chips to share, the steam rising in white curls from the paper wrapping. Imagine the warmth of that small space, the sound of the grease sizzling in the back, and the low murmur of other patrons. While they eat, Millie borrows her friend's mobile phone. At precisely 3:47, she dials her father's number. Her voice is calm, a gentle melody amidst the background noise of the cafe. She tells him she is fine, that she is just having a snack, and that she will be home in about half an hour. It is a simple, unremarkable promise. The plastic of the phone is smooth and slightly warm against her ear. When the call ends, she hands the phone back, finishes her chips, and at 4:05, she steps back out into the cool March air. She begins the walk home alone, her footsteps echoing softly on the pavement as she turns onto Station Avenue. Station Avenue is a long, straight stretch of road lined with trees and suburban homes. On this afternoon, the street is relatively quiet. The air is still, and the light is beginning to take on a silver, pearlescent quality as the clouds thicken. Millie walks with a steady pace, her rucksack shifting slightly with every step. She passes a bus stop where a friend of her sister is waiting. They exchange a quick wave, a fleeting moment of recognition in the fading light. It is approximately 4:08. This is the final time she is seen by someone who knows her. Nearby, a red car, a Daewoo Nexia, is parked, its engine silent, its presence unremarkable to the casual observer. The car is a dull, muted red, blending into the shadows cast by the overhanging trees. The street feels incredibly still now. The sound of her footsteps is the only thing filling the silence. The pavement under her shoes is uneven in places, the roots of the old trees pushing through the asphalt. She continues walking, moving away from the station and toward the heart of the residential area, disappearing into the quiet depth of the afternoon. Back at the Dowler home, the minutes begin to stretch into something heavy and restless. Her father, Bob, looks at the clock. It is past 4:30, the time she promised to be home. The house is quiet, the only sound being the soft tick of a wall clock or the hum of the refrigerator. He waits, expecting to hear the familiar sound of the front door opening, the rattle of keys, and the thump of a rucksack being dropped in the hallway. But the hallway remains empty. Outside, the light has almost completely vanished, replaced by a deep indigo blue. The streetlights finally flicker to life, casting orange pools of light onto the cold pavement of Station Avenue. By 5 o'clock, the silence in the house has turned into a sharp, cold dread. Her sister, Gemma, arrives home and asks where Millie is. The realization that something is wrong begins to settle over the family like a thick, suffocating fog. They call her friends, they check the route, but there is no sign of the girl in the navy blue blazer. The town of Walton-on-Thames is now fully draped in night, and the quiet streets hold a secret they are not yet ready to reveal. The seasons began their slow, rhythmic turn, and the missing girl's face became a permanent fixture on posters that faded under the relentless English rain. Months bled into a new year, and by early February of 2003, a biting chill had settled over the quiet streets of Hampton. The air was sharp, smelling of damp earth and the faint, acrid scent of wood smoke drifting from suburban chimneys. On the night of February 4th, the suburban peace was not just quiet. It was heavy with a stillness that felt brittle, like thin ice over a deep, dark pond. 19-year-old Marcia McDonnell was making her way home after an evening spent with friends at the cinema in Kingston. They had watched a film about a con artist, laughing in the warmth of the theater, blissfully unaware of the true predator moving through the darkness outside. As she stepped out of the cinema, the night air hit her lungs like a splash of cold water. The streetlights cast long, amber pools on the pavement, reflecting off the puddles left by a recent winter shower. She adjusted her coat, pulling the fabric tighter against the damp wind, and walked toward the bus stop. The town of Kingston was winding down, its shops shuttered and its bustling energy replaced by the low hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustle of dry leaves skittering across the concrete. She stepped onto the 111 bus, the familiar hum of the engine a rhythmic, vibrating comfort against the silence of the night. The interior of the bus was bathed in a sterile, fluorescent glow that reflected off the dark windows, turning them into black mirrors where she could see only her own soft reflection and the empty seats behind her. There is a specific kind of loneliness found on a midnight bus. The smell of worn upholstery, the rhythmic hiss of the air brakes, and the way the world outside becomes a blurry tapestry of shadows and street lamps. Marcia sat near the window, perhaps watching the familiar landmarks of her neighborhood slide by in the dark. The bus rumbled through the darkened streets of southwest London, its tires making a soft, wet sound as they navigated the curves of the suburbs. Behind the bus, trailing at a distance that felt both purposeful and patient, was a silver Vauxhall Corsa. It was a small, unassuming car, the kind that blends into the background of any residential street. But inside, the driver was watching the illuminated windows of the bus with a focused, predatory intensity. He saw the lone young woman through the glass, her blonde hair catching the artificial light, and he slowed his pace to match the heavy rhythm of the public transport vehicle ahead of him. The bus slowed as it approached the stop at Priory Road. With a heavy sigh of hydraulics, the doors folded open, and Marcia stepped out into the night. It was 18 minutes past midnight. The bus doors hissed shut behind her, and for a moment, she stood in the sudden vacuum of silence as the large vehicle pulled away, its red taillights fading into the distance. She was only 35 yards from her family home. The street was lined with houses where families slept soundly, their windows dark and their doors locked against the winter cold. The only sound was the soft click of her shoes on the pavement and the distant, low thrum of a car engine idling somewhere nearby. The silver Corsa had pulled into the mouth of Priory Road, its headlights extinguished, disappearing into the deep shadows cast by the overhanging trees. The driver stepped out, moving with a silent, practiced ease that suggested he was a ghost in his own neighborhood. He carried something heavy in his hand, a blunt, iron weight that felt cold against his palm. He watched her walk, her pace steady and unsuspecting, her mind likely already drifting toward the warmth of her bed and the quiet safety of her front door. In the darkness of Priory Road, the air suddenly thickened with a violence that left no room for warning. 3 heavy blows were delivered with a terrifying, mechanical precision. There was no struggle, no chance for her to raise her arms in defense. The attack was so swift and so brutal that it seemed to swallow the very air around her. A neighbor, resting in the quiet of his bedroom, heard a dull thud, the sound of something heavy hitting the pavement, followed by a short, intense scream that cut through the night like a blade. Then the silence returned, deeper and more suffocating than before. A car door closed with a muffled metallic click, and the faint sound of tires spinning on damp asphalt signaled the departure of the shadow. When the neighbor looked out into the street, he saw only the amber glow of the lamps and the empty stretch of road. But as his eyes adjusted, he noticed a dark shape on the pavement just yards from the McDonald gate. Marcia lay there, a fallen figure in the moonlight, her life slipping away in the cold air of Hampton. Her family, just a thin wall of brick and mortar away, remained unaware for those first few terrible minutes that their world had just been irrevocably shattered. The aftermath was a blur of blue lights and the frantic, rhythmic pulse of sirens that shattered the suburban quiet. Neighbors stood in their doorways, wrapped in dressing gowns, their faces pale with a shock that would soon turn into a paralyzing fear. Marcia was rushed to Kingston Hospital, but the magnitude of her injuries was too great. 2 days later, on February 5th, surrounded by her devastated family, the 19-year-old took her final breath. The community of Hampton, once a place of perceived safety and predictable routines, was gripped by a cold, encroaching dread. People began to look at the bus stops differently. The once benign hum of a passing van or the sight of a car slowing down in the dark became a source of heart-pounding suspicion. The police were baffled, searching for a motive in a crime that seemed to have none. There was no robbery, no clear connection between the victim and her killer. It was a phantom attack, a random strike by a man who treated the streets of West London like a private hunting ground. And as the investigation began to stall, the silver car was quietly sold, and its driver prepared to flee to the sun-drenched beaches of Tenerife, leaving behind a trail of blood and a neighborhood that would never truly sleep soundly again. The midnight air in Isleworth on that late Friday in May, 2004, carried the gentle scent of spring grass and the cooling dampness of the pavement. For 18-year-old Kate Sheedy, the night had been a celebration, a threshold between the familiar halls of Gumley House Convent School and the vast, unwritten future of university life. As she stepped off the H-22 bus onto Wharton Road, the heavy hiss of the pneumatic doors and the receding rumble of the engine were the only sounds in the stillness. She was merely moments from the front door of her home, her keys already held in her hand, the cold metal a small comfort against her palm. But as the red tail lights of the bus vanished into the darkness, a different sound began to lace through the quiet. It was the low, rhythmic thud of an idling engine, a mechanical heartbeat that felt out of place in the sleeping suburb. Near the entrance of a darkened industrial estate, she noticed the silhouette of a large, white vehicle. It sat there, a pale ghost against the shadows, its headlights extinguished and its windows shrouded in a deep, impenetrable black. The air seemed to grow thinner, more still, as Kate's instincts, honed by the subtle language of the night, whispered a warning that something was not right. Kate decided to cross the road, her footsteps quickening as she moved toward a pedestrian island in the center of the tarmac. She hoped the distance would provide safety, a buffer between her and the silent, white shape. But as her feet reached the refuge of the island, the silence was shattered. The vehicle's headlights suddenly flared to life, two blinding orbs of white light that cut through the darkness like a predator's eyes. The engine, previously a low hum, erupted into a violent, guttural roar. Without warning, the driver performed a sharp, deliberate U-turn, the tires screaming against the road as the heavy machine turned its focus toward her. There was no time to run, no time to hide. The white people carrier surged forward, a wall of cold steel and glass moving with terrifying purpose. The impact was a dull, sickening weight that stole the breath from her chest and cast her onto the hard, unyielding ground. The world became a blur of spinning shadows and the smell of exhaust. As she lay face down, the heavy frame of the car moved over her, the undercarriage a dark canopy of heat and grease. Then, the vehicle braked. For a heartbeat, there was a terrible, expectant pause. Then came the crunch of the gears and the sound of the engine straining as the car reversed, the heavy wheels passing over her body a second time, pressing her into the grit of the road with a cruelty that defied comprehension. The machine sped away, leaving the street to return to its eerie, deceptive quiet. Kate lay on the pavement, the world reduced to the sensation of the rough tarmac against her cheek and the agonizing struggle to pull air into her lungs. Her body was a map of trauma. Her liver was ruptured, her ribs broken, and one of her lungs had collapsed under the immense pressure of the car's weight. Yet, in the hollow of that moment, a flicker of incredible resilience took hold. She knew she had to move, even if only by inches. With a strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her physical self, she reached for her handbag, her fingers fumbling through the dark until they found her mobile phone. Her voice, once clear and bright with the joy of graduation, was now a fragile, broken whisper. She called her mother. The conversation was brief, a frantic map of pain and location, as she told her parents she had been run over, that it had been no accident, and that she loved them. She felt the life within her beginning to drift, like a candle flickering in a drafty room, but she refused to let the flame go out. She lay there, staring at the stars and the orange glow of the streetlights, waiting for the sound of help, clinging to the details of what had just happened as if they were a lifeline. When the paramedics arrived, they found a young woman who was fading, her physical injuries so severe that she should not have been conscious. But Kate Sheedy was more than a victim. She was a witness. Even as they lifted her onto the stretcher, and the blue lights began their rhythmic dance against the suburban brickwork, she was thinking. Within 2 hours of the attack, lying in a hospital bed with a plastic mask delivering oxygen to her struggling lungs, she spoke to a detective. Despite the fog of pain and the heavy weight of shock, her mind remained sharp, focused on the white shape that had tried to end her life. She described the vehicle with painstaking clarity, a white Toyota Previa, a people carrier with distinctive blacked-out windows. She insisted that the attack was no mistake, that the driver had meant to kill her. This detail, provided in the earliest, most fragile hours of her recovery, would become the cornerstone of the hunt for a shadow. While her body began the long, agonizing process of healing, her words were already moving through the police stations of London, connecting the dots between a series of tragedies. Her courage in those first moments of survival provided the very thread that the investigators needed to pull, a thread that would eventually lead them to the door of a man who believed he could vanish into the night without a trace. The air in London during the middle of August, 2004, was thick and heavy, a humid blanket that seemed to trap the scent of sun-warmed pavement and river water long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. On the evening of Thursday, the 19th of August, 22-year-old Amélie de Lagrange was enjoying the simple, vibrant pleasures of a summer night. She had moved from France to perfect her English, finding work at a patisserie where the smell of sugar and yeast defined her mornings. That evening, she was surrounded by the melodic chatter of friends at a wine bar called the Crystal Room. The glass in her hand was cool, the condensation forming small, clear beads that traced slow paths down toward the stem. Inside the bar, the world felt small and safe, filled with the low hum of laughter and the clinking of silverware. Amélie was a young woman of grace and intellect, described by those who knew her as sensible and bright. As the evening progressed, she checked the time, mindful of her journey home. She was slightly tipsy, buoyed by the warmth of friendship and the balmy London night, unaware that the quiet streets outside were being watched by eyes that saw not a person, but a target. At approximately 9:39 in the evening, Amélie stepped out into the night air. The transition from the amber glow of the wine bar to the indigo shadows of London Road was stark. She walked toward the bus stop, her footsteps light on the pavement. A closed-circuit television camera captured her boarding the number 267 bus, a grain of digital memory showing a young woman with fair hair and a life full of promise. The bus journey was a familiar rhythm, the low, vibrating rumble of the engine, the hiss of the air brakes at every stop, and the rhythmic flickering of streetlights passing through the windows like a metronome. Perhaps the warmth of the evening or the gentle swaying of the vehicle lulled her into a momentary lapse in concentration, for Amélie missed her usual stop. She realized her mistake too late, finally stepping off the bus at the Fulwell bus garage. The air here was stiller, the silence of the residential outskirts beginning to settle. Rather than waiting for another bus in the cooling air, she decided to walk back toward her home in Twickenham, a journey that would take her across the wide, dark expanse of Twickenham Green. Twickenham Green at night is a place of deep, velvet shadows and wide-open spaces. In the daytime, it is a hub of community life, where the thwack of a cricket bat against a leather ball echoes over the grass. But on this night, under the weight of the summer heat, it felt isolated. The grass was dry underfoot, crunching slightly as Amélie began her walk across the open ground. The streetlights around the perimeter of the green cast long, skeletal shadows of the trees across the cricket pitch. There was a profound quiet here, the kind of silence that makes one acutely aware of their own breathing and the soft rustle of their clothing. Unbeknownst to her, a white Ford courier van was circling the area. It moved with a predatory slowness, its headlights like two dim eyes searching the darkness. The driver, a man named Levi Bellfield, was a person of immense, simmering rage, a hunter who frequented bus routes looking for young, fair-haired women. He saw Amélie as she moved through the darkness, a solitary figure against the vastness of the green. He parked the van, the engine clicking as it cooled in the humid night, and stepped out into the shadows, a heavy, blunt instrument gripped in his hand. The attack was sudden and brutal, a violent intrusion into the stillness of the park. Amélie had no time to defend herself, no chance to cry out into the night. She was found at approximately 10:30 that evening by a passerby who noticed a pale shape on the grass near the cricket square. At first, it might have looked like someone had simply fallen asleep in the warmth of the night, but as they drew closer, the reality became clear. She was lying face down, her life force ebbing away into the thirsty soil of the green. Her handbag and mobile phone were gone, stolen as trophies or perhaps disposed of in a frantic attempt to hide the motive. Paramedics arrived, their blue lights reflecting off the white picket fences and the leaves of the trees, but the injuries to her head were catastrophic. Despite the desperate efforts of the medical staff at West Middlesex Hospital, Amélie passed away shortly after midnight. The news of her death sent a shiver through the community of Twickenham. This was supposed to be a safe place, a neighborhood where young women could walk home after a night with friends without fear. But as the police began to cordon off the green, the realization dawned that a shadow had returned to their streets. Detective Chief Inspector Colin Sutton was assigned to the case, and as he stood on the damp grass of Twickenham Green, his mind began to pull at the threads of the past. There was a haunting familiarity to the scene. 18 months earlier, another young woman, Marcia McDonnell, had been killed in a similar fashion just a few miles away in Hampton. She, too, had been fair-haired, and she, too, had been attacked from behind after getting off a bus. Then there was the case of Kate Sheedy, who had been intentionally run over by a vehicle just months before Amelie's death. The pattern was invisible to some, but to the investigators, it was becoming a vivid, terrifying map. They looked at the timing of the phone calls, the movement of the white van on the CCTV footage, and the specific, cruel nature of the blunt force trauma. The quiet of Twickenham Green had been shattered, but in the echoes of that violence, the police were finding the first real clues to a predator who believed he was invisible. They began to realize that they were not looking for a random act of madness, but for a man who systematically hunted at the edges of the light, waiting for the moment when the world went quiet and a victim was most alone. The air in the incident room was thick and stagnant, a heavy mixture of ozone from the humming electronics, the bitter, scorched scent of overbrewed coffee, and the faint, metallic tang of cold radiators. Detective Chief Inspector Colin Sutton sat at the heart of this digital labyrinth, his silhouette cast against the beige walls in sharp, jagged lines by the constant flicker of the monitors. The room was a sanctuary of artificial light in the middle of a world that had long since gone to sleep, a place where the ordinary rules of time seemed to dissolve into the steady, rhythmic whirring of hard drives and the soft, repetitive clicking of computer mice. Outside the window, the London night was a deep, charcoal gray, a light drizzle slicking the pavement and muffling the distant sounds of the city. But inside, the atmosphere was one of strained, silent intensity. Every officer was hunched over a screen, their faces rendered pale and washed out by the cold blue glow of the displays. Colin adjusted his glasses, the cool metal of the frames providing a sharp contrast to the heat radiating from his tired skin. His eyes were dry, burning with the strain of watching thousands of hours of absolute nothingness, yet his focus remained anchored. He was looking for a ghost, a phantom that had haunted the suburban streets for years, and he knew with a quiet, bone-deep certainty that the answer lay hidden somewhere within this electronic forest of pixels and static. The task before them was monumental, an undertaking that required the kind of patience that borders on the obsessive. They had gathered over 2,000 hours of closed-circuit television footage, a staggering collection of tapes and digital files that felt like a mountain of discarded memories. There were images from traffic cameras perched high on metal poles, from the grainy security systems of corner shops, and from the interior cameras of buses that rattled through the night like illuminated glass boxes. To an outsider, the footage was a blur of meaningless, everyday movement, a tapestry of trees swaying in the autumn wind, of empty residential streets, and of the occasional fox darting across a manicured garden. But for the team, every single frame was a potential witness to a crime. They sat in the dim light, the only sound the soft click of buttons as they rewound and fast-forwarded in a hypnotic, soul-crushing loop. Colin watched as his officers moved through the hours, their fingers hovering over the keyboards, their gazes locked on the screens until the images began to bleed together. The blue light reflected in their unblinking eyes, making them look like statues carved from ice. They were looking for a pattern, a recurring shape in the darkness that would tell them where the predator had been, and more importantly, where he was going next. It was during one of these long, lightless stretches of the early morning that a specific shape first appeared on the screen. It did not arrive with a flourish or a sudden burst of clarity. It was simply there, a pale, rectangular blur drifting through the corner of a low-resolution frame. Colin felt a sudden, sharp jolt of adrenaline, a tightening in his gut that told him to stop. He leaned forward, his nose almost touching the warm glass of the monitor as he squinted at the flickering image. There, he whispered, the word barely audible over the mechanical hum of the room. He clicked the mouse, freezing the frame. The image was a chaotic mess of gray and white, the resolution so poor that the edges of the objects seemed to vibrate with electronic noise. But as he painstakingly adjusted the contrast and brightness, the shape began to resolve into something recognizable. It was a car, a white Vauxhall Astra, its distinct sloping back and rounded front end emerging slowly from the digital fog. It was an Astra Mark IV, a common, unremarkable vehicle, yet in this specific location, at this specific hour of 2004, it felt like a violent intrusion. The car was a stark, bone-white against the deep, velvet blacks of the midnight street, its headlights appearing as two glowing, featureless orbs that stared back at the investigators from the recorded past. With this new lead, the team began to hunt for the car across other camera feeds, a painstaking process of tracking a single drop of white through a vast sea of shadows. They found it again 2 miles away, then again near a quiet bus stop, its presence always hovering just on the periphery of the victim's known path. The behavior of the driver was chilling to observe in such a detached, clinical environment. The Astra did not move like a car on a journey with a destination. It moved like a shark on a slow, deliberate patrol. It would slow down as it approached a lone figure on the pavement, its brake lights glowing a dull, angry red for a few seconds before it accelerated away with a puff of exhaust. They watched it circle a single block 3 times, its headlights sweeping over garden fences and closed curtains like a searchlight seeking out a target. The silence in the incident room grew heavier as the officers realized exactly what they were seeing. This was the anatomy of a hunt, captured in the cold, unfeeling eye of a lens. The white Vauxhall Astra was no longer just a vehicle. It was a mobile blind, a piece of urban camouflage that allowed the killer to hide in plain sight while he selected his next victim from the shadows of the night. The ultimate breakthrough came when the team managed to isolate a specific frame where the light of a passing bus hit the car at just the right angle. For a fraction of a second, the blurred mass of the vehicle sharpened, revealing the unique contours of the Astra's bodywork and the dull reflection of its standard hubcaps. It was a victory born of pure, unadulterated persistence and a refusal to look away from the screen. Detective Chief Inspector Collins Sutton knew that this single, grainy image was the key that would finally unlock the entire investigation. It gave them a target, a tangible, physical object to pursue through the mountains of registration data and ownership records. The room, which had been heavy with the fog of exhaustion just an hour before, was now electric with a new sense of purpose. They had finally found the vessel of the monster. As the first light of dawn began to gray the edges of the window blinds, the team did not stop. They kept scrolling, kept searching, and kept documenting every movement of that white car. The Vauxhall Astra was no longer a ghost. It was a trail of breadcrumbs leading them straight toward the door of a man who believed he was invisible. The grainy frame had become a window into the truth, and the hunt was finally closing in. Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Levi Bellfield and the verdict in the shadows. The air on the morning of November 22nd, 2004, was thick with a biting, damp chill that seemed to cling to the very brickwork of West Twickenham. At 5:30 in the morning, the world is usually a sanctuary of silence, broken only by the distant hum of a lonely milk float or the rustle of dead leaves dancing across the pavement. But on this morning, the stillness was tactical. A team of officers moved through the gray, pre-dawn mist, their footsteps muffled by the heavy dew on the grass. They approached a modest flat at Collingwood Place, their breath blooming in small, ghostly clouds before them. Inside that flat lay a man who had become a specter in the night, a figure whose presence had turned ordinary bus stops into places of quiet dread. When the door finally gave way, the silence of the neighborhood was shattered, not by violence, but by the heavy weight of an ending. The man they took into custody was 46 years old, a former bouncer with a barrel chest and a gaze that seemed to hold no light. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting long, pale shadows across the Thames, the long hunt for the bus stop stalker had finally reached its conclusion. The investigation that followed was a slow, meticulous unwinding of a dark tapestry. Detectives sat in quiet rooms, surrounded by the hum of cooling computers and the smell of stale coffee, staring at grainy frames of footage that had been scrubbed and enhanced until the pixels whispered their secrets. They looked at the white Daewoo Nexia, a car that had appeared like a phantom on the edge of a security camera near Walton-on-Thames station on that fateful day in March 2002. It was a mundane vehicle, the kind that usually fades into the background of a busy street, but here it was everything. Forensic teams discovered a haunting truth that sent a shiver through the hearts of the investigators. This man had lived a mere 50 yards from where 13-year-old Millie Dowler was last seen. From his window, he could have watched the world go by, could have seen the very spot where a young life was intercepted. The proximity was a chilling realization, a reminder of how closely the mundane and the monstrous can coexist. They traced the car's movements, matching the flickering images on the screen to the cellular pings of mobile phones that moved through the night like fireflies in the dark. Every piece of evidence was a heavy stone, carefully placed to build a wall from which there would be no escape. The trial began in October 2007, within the hallowed, wood-paneled walls of the Old Bailey. The courtroom was a place of heavy, velvet silence, where the air felt thick with the collective grief of families who had waited years for this moment. The defendant's dock, however, was often a void. He was a man who chose to hide in the cells below, refusing to face the mothers and fathers whose lives he had fractured. It was a final, quiet act of cowardice that did not go unnoticed by the judge or the jury. As the details of the attacks on Marcia McDonnell and Amelie de Lagrange were read aloud, the room seemed to grow colder. The jury listened to the accounts of the night in 2003, when Marcia was struck down near her home, and the late summer evening in 2004, when Amelie's life was taken on the quiet grass of Twickenham Green. They heard from Kate Sheedy, a brave young woman who had survived being run over twice, her voice a steady anchor in a sea of dark testimony. The prosecution painted a picture of a predator who targeted the vulnerable in the dead of night, a man driven by an unreasoning hatred that no one could fully comprehend. The weight of the words hung in the air like dust motes in a shaft of fading light. In February 2008, the first verdict arrived. The jury found him guilty of the murders of Marcia and Amelie and the attempted murder of Kate. The judge, speaking to an empty dock, handed down a sentence of life imprisonment with a whole life tariff, ensuring he would never again walk beneath the open sky. But the shadow of Millie Dowler still lingered, a case that had remained open for nearly a decade. It wasn't until 2011 that he was brought back to court to face the final reckoning for the schoolgirl's disappearance. This second trial was a grueling journey through the memories of a family that had been broken but remained resilient. The evidence of the white car and the cell site data finally closed the circle. On the 23rd of June, 2011, the verdict of guilty echoed through the chamber once more. He became the first person in British history to be handed 2 whole life orders. It was a definitive, crushing end to a story that had haunted the suburbs of London for far too long. The legacy of the case was one of immense loss, but also of a relentless pursuit of justice that refused to let the darkness win. The streets he once prowled returned to their quiet rhythms, though the memory of those years remains etched into the history of the city. As the years passed in the quiet confines of prison, The man occasionally made headlines with whispered confessions that he later retracted, a final attempt to keep a flicker of control over the narrative of his crimes. In 2016, he admitted to the abduction and murder of Millie Dowler for the first time, only to pull the words back shortly after. But the truth no longer depended on his voice. The forensic links, the tireless work of Detective Colin Sutton and his team, and the unwavering courage of the survivors had already spoken. The investigation changed the way police tracked vehicles and monitored the movements of suspects, a technical legacy born from a tragedy. The bus stops are now just bus stops again, places of transition where people wait for a ride home under the soft glow of streetlights. The fear has faded into a somber reflection, a lesson in vigilance and the enduring strength of the community. We look back at these events not to invite the shadows back in, but to appreciate the light that eventually found its way through the gloom. The story of the man who stalked the night is over, replaced by the enduring memory of the young women who were loved and are still remembered with every passing season. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.